Is the North finally coming to terms with its slavery past? So there's an article about this at the Portland Press Herald I'd like to share with you. This came out a few days ago. It says here, Freeport revisits its historic role in the slave trade. Kathleen Sullivan shares the discovery of her former home's connections to the slave trade and the pitfalls of a romanticized past. Story by Paul Bagnall, last name Bagnall. Welcome back to the channel, Culture Confederacy here. It's early Sunday morning, so happy Sunday, everybody. As you know, I do these in one take. They are what they are. No fancy graphics, nothing like that. And thank you again for watching and subscribing. And if you're new, hope you know what you're getting yourself into. So we cover different topics here on the channel. It can be everything from talking about slavery to music, what's going on currently with Trump attacking Iran, you name it, we talk about it all here on the channel. So let's get to this. It says here, the Freeport Historical Society is taking a critical look at the town's role in the New England slave economy through historical recovery and storytelling. At a community event earlier this month, organized by the Freeport Historical Society, Freeport essayist Kathleen Sullivan explored how a romanticized version of the past can paper over the dark parts of American history. Now, I find this to be a real scream, because were we told for years, for decades after the Civil War, that it's all the South's fault? They tell us about the lost cause. Could there possibly be a lost cause in the North? Because you got to remember, pardon me, with gradual emancipation, which is really the system that these northern states adopted once they abolished slavery, it wasn't the living slave who was freed. It was generally the son or daughter, the offspring of the living slave that was freed after so many years of service. So if, let's say, that law was passed in 1820 in whatever the state was, well, a lot of times you're talking, pardon me again, 20 to 30 years worth of service from their offspring, son or daughter. So that brings you up to the mid-1850s. 1840s, late 1840s, mid-1850s. So these states that passed these abolition laws didn't just do this overnight. It took time. And a lot of times, as I mentioned before here on the channel, especially in the South, slave labor, anything to do with the plantation system, was done through a system of contracts. So that was a legal binding agreement for so many years of service, or whatever the, sorry, my throat's giving me fits today, whatever the term of service was, or whatever the agreement was. But I just think this is a real scream, as I said, that now all of a sudden they're coming to terms with their own past in the North regarding slavery. In other words, it was a quote-unquote national problem. This wasn't something that was happening in the South because you had northern banks that invested in southern plantations, i.e. the Bank of New York. Sullivan presented the history of Rufus Soul's house at Porter's Landing to 40 attendees in the parish hall at the South Freeport Congregational Church on Saturday, February 7th. Sullivan lived in the Rufus Soul house for decades with her husband and 2 kids before selling it over 8 years ago. Now, a question here. If these people in the North are so, in Maine, in Freeport, are so racked with guilt over what happened with slavery, why did you purchase this home? Soul was a prominent Freeport businessman and shipbuilder in the historic neighborhood of Porter's Landing, said Eric Smith, executive director of the Freeport Historical Society. Soul's name comes up often in examinations of the town's role in the Atlantic slave trade. Quote, there are 2 stories here. One is about having found out the secret of the house that I lived in for so long, and then the secret of the house. It's a secret. She just found out about this. And then the other story is the story of the community coming to terms with the stories of who we are in this town. What sounds to me, just as a casual observer here, it sounds to me like these people are, these activists or these people that are going back and digging through the history of what happened with slavery in the North or the South, South or the North, vice versa, sounds to me like they just are suffering from either white guilt, or they just don't want to admit to the fact that, yes, maybe you had slavery in the North. Rufus Sewell was a prominent leader of the American Colonization Society, and Nathan Nye, another prominent merchant in Freeport, who wrote letters and donated money to the organization. Now, I don't know if you heard about this organization. I read up about this a while back, or can't even talk tonight. I researched this a while back. There you go. It says here, the American Colonization Society focused on the idea that freed African Americans shouldn't stay in the country and should instead be shipped to Liberia and Africa, Smith said. One ship transporting here you go, folks. Here you go. One ship transporting freed slaves back to Africa was the Chieftain, built by Rufus Sewell in 1849, which paid to take several hundred African Americans to Liberia to be freed, but many were not from there originally. The Chieftain forcibly deported some passengers, including children without parents or guardians. So they basically just dropped these people off in the middle of nowhere in Africa. Yeah, you're free, but we'll take you back to Africa, no extra charge, and they just drop them off. Forcibly deporting some passengers, including children without parents or guardians. This was one of the arguments that the South made in their secession documents. If you go back and you read them, they said, you want to free the slaves, but you're not offering an alternative here of what you're going to do when you free them. Where are they going to go? And what happened after the Civil War? Then we had the slaves that were freed. They ended back up on the plantation because they had nowhere else to go. Another Freeport ship with suspected involvement in the slave trade was the Rufus Sewell, which was sunk off the coast of Africa in 1858 by the British cruiser Viper. By the 1850s, the main built and owned ships were the predominant vessels in the Atlantic slave trade, according to research by Kate McMahon and Meadow Dibble of the Atlantic Black Box Public History Project. Although Congress prohibited the cross-Atlantic slave trade in 1808, the law was rarely enforced, and that's true. In fact, the South really started cracking down, believe it or not, on the illegal slave trade because you still had them bringing slaves up from South America, and what they would do is try to go up to the North and drop those slaves off in the North, even though you have these abolitionist states, and even though you have free states in the North, there was a stipulation in their law, i.e., the state of New York, where you could spend so many months of the year live in that state with your slaves or travel through that state with your slaves for a certain amount of time. Again, it was a much more complex issue with slavery, and abolition didn't happen overnight. As America abolished slavery, Freeport was polarized over support for abolition and the fate of formerly enslaved people. Quote, lots of people are profiting from the slave economy from both the shipbuilding aspect of not only moving enslaved people, but moving goods produced by enslaved labor, Smith said, and they're also profiting because the whole country's economy is tied up in that. Exactly. So the answer's right in front of you. It's right in front of these people. What was going on? Everybody played a part in this. The North was very dependent. Northern businesses were very dependent. Northern industry on Southern plantations, on these goods being produced in the South. Remember, Lincoln said, what are we going to do about the cotton, King Cotton? And you also had a lot of these northern entities that would invest in Southern plantations, like I said, the Bank of New York, and a lot of them were absentee situations. So you'd have a overseer, or you might have a yeoman farmer that leased out the services of a slave. That was the most common way to obtain a slave's services because not everybody could afford slaves back then. So a lot of times you had this leasing of slave services for so many months, maybe so many years. And a lot of times these yeoman farmers or these smaller plantations or plots of land, pardon me again. I told you my throat's getting me fits tonight, but we're just working through this. But they would often break even. So they didn't make a whole lot of money. And God forbid you had a really bad deep freeze or something in the South that year, and that's been known to happen. It happened in 86 with the citrus crops in Florida. I know I grew up in the Tampa Bay area. That's here the Challenger exploded. You had the Challenger disaster. Well, that happened because you had a hard freeze that year. And it destroyed, I remember it destroying all the citrus crops. In fact, tourism was affected by that as well back in '86 because we didn't have as many tourists that came down during the winter months because it had gotten so cold. But the Freeport Historical Society, getting back to the article, plans to hold more events like the storytelling event at the South Freeport Congregational Church going forward, according to Sullivan, as the town's historical society recovers more information. So I wanted to share this with you because we just need to understand something about history. History is not perfect. Never has been. And if you're looking for utopia, which I think a lot of these activists were, you're going to be sadly disappointed. That line, all men are created equal. I don't want to go down a different route here, or go off the deep end here in the video. But that line, all men are created equal, really had nothing to do with equality of the races or ending slavery. It was about political equality for the colonists, who at the time wanted a second Europe for white men without a king. Now, that may sound racist to us, but at that time, that was a real thing. That was something they were dealing with because of the corruption that was happening in Europe at the time, especially when you had like I said, can't even talk tonight, when you had the church in bed with, the king and, the monarchy and the aristocracy, a lot of corruption. And that's what the founders were trying to avoid. Go back and you read all these different arguments they had during the ratification debates about having things like a president or having a national bank. They didn't want to live under a monarch. And they wanted to avoid the corruption they saw in Europe. And this is at a time when you had slavery in all 13 colonies. So was the American Revolution, was that a lost cause? Was the incorporation or the creation of Freeport, Maine, was that a lost cause? Because Freeport had slaves, or they had these slave ships? So there's a lot of nuance with history is my point here. But I thought I'd share this with you. Interesting article again over at the Portland Press Herald, town of Freeport, Maine, coming to terms with its slave past, especially with these ships that were built, these slave ships that were built in Freeport. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. Follow me at Instagram at Jason197711. You can go to Substack. I do articles on Substack. And you can find me at Culture Confederacy, Culture Confed1 on X. So this is the Culture Confederacy saying, peace out, God bless, keep up the culture, catch you next time, and thank you for letting me stumble my way through this, and I'm sorry that my throat's, that I'm kind of, my voice isn't up to par tonight, but hope you enjoyed the video anyways, and I'll catch you next time. You all have a great Sunday. Take care.